Board has sponsored a number of talks on the history of Congregationalism. Next year, we celebrate our 300th anniversary. Past talks have ranged from the founding of Fairfield to most recently talks on the Civil War era. You can find recordings of all our talks on the adult education webpage on the church website. I think it would be helpful for me to remind you that we had a talk on the standing order in Connecticut. This is the Congregational Church State created in Hartford in 1639 by Roger Ludlow that lasted until 1818. As we hear about New England's history of colonial relations with Native Americans in Connecticut and Massachusetts, realize it's almost exclusively Congregationalists we're talking about. Today we welcome Paul Wegner, Assistant Director of the Institute of Native American Studies in Washington, Connecticut. Paul holds a BA in Anthropology from Franklin Pierce College and an MA in Experimental Archaeology from the University of Exeter in Exeter, England. Paul has worked in the archaeology field for over 17 years and serves on the board of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. Our topic is Congregationalism and the Native Americans. Paul will address some questions from you, the audience. At the end, we need to get a microphone in front of you if you have a question, because that's the only way it will be recorded on the YouTube recording we're making right now. And without further ado, welcome Paul.
Thank you. Can everybody can hear me all right? You can hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Moore. I wanted to start off by just doing kind of a land acknowledgement, and I wanted to acknowledge that this church, the town of the city of Fairfield, Fairfield County, sits on the ancestral homelands of the Pugussit, whose ancestors are currently the Golden Hill Pugussit, located in Trumbull, Connecticut. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with both colonial and indigenous kind of relationships. And I wanted to address that although we acknowledge that this is sitting on the ancestral homelands of the Pugussit, there's more that we can do. And I would love to talk to you guys afterwards if you're interested in finding out more that we can do to kind of increase relationships between the indigenous people who are here, who are extant, who are existing, who live right down the road from you, and engaging with them and learning from them, and they can learn from you as well. I think that one of the things that we forget is that these are relationships, and that everyone coming into a relationship is coming into it with their own baggage, and we kind of see that in the past as well. And I want to thank you for inviting me here. This is the first time that I've ever spoken in a church building outside of speaking for the church. My father was a pastor of an evangelical church for all of my life. I did a lot of work up in the front of the church, but not ever doing a talk on history. So Mr. Moore sent me some questions, and we're going to just kind of go through them as quickly as I can. And I'll read them off here. Describe Native Americans, which we're going to refer to as NA status in New England prior to 1620. What were the major tribes and federations in the area and current Massachusetts and Connecticut? And what was the Native American population in Massachusetts and Connecticut prior to 1620? To what degree did the population reduce by disease? Well, there was already this kind of increase in political complexity prior to contact with the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the English. As early as the 1500s, we see that powerful leaders within the Narragansett, the Pugussit, the Mohegan, the Wampanoag, all located along the coastal environments of what is present-day Rhode Island, present-day Massachusetts, and Connecticut, were all kind of vying for power in these kind of tributary economies where those who lived on the coast had a lot of kind of sway over interior groups like the Pugussit. that are located around here. And so the major tribes that we see within this area, are the Pequot, the Narragansett, and the Mohegan, with the Mohawk to the north near the Hudson Valley. And to what are the major tribes and what is the population? We don't know. Our best estimates are somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 individuals were here prior to contact, with a estimated 50 to 90% loss of life prior to or just about at contact. This is because we don't have any written records. Indigenous people practice an oral tradition. The oral tradition means that they didn't write anything down, and so when people were contacted by both the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony, by people in Virginia, they had already been ravaged by disease. We can imagine that, you guys know the 1492, you know who sailed the ocean blue. And by that time, the Spanish had already been in Florida, and disease had swept up from Florida all the way into New England prior to even the Mayflower arriving. And so we see this impact is already affecting them before even the English arrive, before the Puritans come. And so when they arrive, they think that it's deserted. They see empty villages. One of the things that they failed to understand was that indigenous people, even though they were settled, moved in kind of cyclical nature based on the seasons, but also diseases from Florida, like smallpox, had already come up the coast of the eastern states and ravaged their societies. And so this emptiness is something that we're going to talk about in a little bit, because it has to do with this kind of viewpoint of how everyone saw Native Americans politically and kind of in land sense, right? Okay, what could be said regarding treaties with the European colonists and Native Americans? Are there explanations for the success of the 50-year treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag? And what are significant treaties that followed the Pequot War? This is a big question. Treaties between colonists and Native Americans were mutually beneficial in the early days, we'll say. This is because it was more resource-oriented. Originally, we can define different kind of settlements as kind of resource colonialism versus settler colonialism. And so resource colonialism, like that of the French and some Dutch groups, are looking to come to different spaces, use the resources, and then leave. Settler colonialism is when colonists come to use the resources, send some things back home, but also stay and build a life. And so initial treaties are based on these resource acquisitions. I will take this and I will give you this. I will take these resources and we'll give you these resources. And so it was kind of a mutually beneficial act between colonists and between indigenous groups. The 50-year treaty between the Wampanoag was that Massanutten, who was the sachem of the Wampanoag, set this up in 1621, and the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had this mutual agreement that they were going to not impose on each other's land. And so the Puritans living on the coast of Massachusetts sought to keep the land that they had. They didn't really want to expand. They weren't like what we were thinking of when we think of American westward expansion. This is not what we're thinking of in the early colonial period. And so this 50-year treaty was kept in place because both groups mutually saw this as beneficial. It wasn't until Metacom, who was Massanutten's son, took over the Wampanoag, and he began to see that this was not mutually beneficial, that the English were kind of starting to encroach on lands that were given to, or at least within land transactions set aside for Wampanoag people. They started to encroach down into what is now present-day Connecticut, and they started to move into places that were not part of the treaty. And so Massanutten's son, Metacom, as we'll see, decided to start a war. And this was called King Philip's War, which came after the Pequot War. Significant treaties that were made following the Pequot War. Pequot War takes place between 1636 and 1638. It was the first major war that we had here in the eastern part of the United States. It was the first major war that we can kind of contact in the United States itself, between colonists and between indigenous people. And one of the things that we see that come out of the Pequot War is that there was this kind of power vacuum that takes place. And after the Pequot War, the Pequots themselves, there was the Treaty of Hartford, which is signed in 1638. The Treaty of Hartford leaves all Pequot people to relinquish their name. They can no longer be called Pequot. They are then sold as slaves to Mohegans, to Narragansett, and to tribal groups in the West Indies. One of the reasons why they did this is because they initially started to sell them to tribal groups in the South, and they escaped, and they knew how to maneuver their way back up to the Northeast. And so they sent them to places where they couldn't be maneuvering back up, which was the islands in the West Indies. And so this idea that after the Pequot War, that the Pequots lost so badly that they could no longer hold their name, that they now would become somebody else, really impacted a lot of their descendants. Metacom, being both Wampanoag and Pequot, was highly affected by this. And he saw that there wasn't really any stopping the English as they moved into Connecticut and into Rhode Island and started to move westward. And he knew that they were here to stay. And so one of the things that we see is that he felt that he had to kind of stop them. And in 1675, as we'll see when we talk about the praying towns, he started his own war, which ended up being the bloodiest war in American history outside of the Civil War. And this is taking place in the 1600s, before America was even considered to be America. I wanted to read you something from the Treaty of Hartford from 1638. And one of the reasons this was so important was that both the English and the Dutch recognized, I don't know if you guys have heard of wampum as a shell bead, and you might be thinking of it as Indian money. We often refer to it as Indian currency. This is incorrect. It's a shell bead that has significant value culturally for these groups. And one of the reasons why the Pequot, the Narragansett, the Wampanoag, all of these coastal groups had a lot of power within these tributary economies was because of this important bead. And we actually have a really important aspect of wampum. It's the shells that grow here in Connecticut are purple. I don't know if you guys have ever seen any like clam shells. They have like the purple inside, right? You can find them on the beach. I find them with my kids on Fairfield Beach all the time. They have the purple inside. This purple comes from the shell's processing of the tannins that are in the water. As you go north, they get lighter. As you go south, they get redder. It's only here, only in like Connecticut, Rhode Island, that we have this deep purple, which was highly prized by groups throughout New England and into New York State. And so this wampum was really important, and that both the Dutch and the English recognized this. And it's this recognition of wampum as an important cultural item that lead to the Pequot War. They want to maneuver and leverage this item in order to get more materials out of the groups that they're dealing with. In so much that they are trading with groups like the Pequot to then get wampum, to then go to the Hudson Valley and trade with other groups with that wampum. Eventually, they make their own wampum and they bypass everyone in general. But a lot of deals were done between colonial groups with this wampum as a currency. This is why we think of it as Indian money, even though it's not. And this is from the Treaty of Hartford, which is the ending of the Pequot War. And it says that 1 fathom, so one amount of fathom is like I think it's like 20 or 25 beads of wampum, is for a white wampum is to be paid for each adult male. 1/2 a fathom of white wampum is to be paid each for each Pequot youth. 1 hand's length of white wampum is for each male child. This payment shall be made to the English each year, the time of the tilling of the corn in July, right? So Pequots were, after the Treaty of Hartford, sold for wampum on an annual basis. And so, what's that? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. You're welcome. Is that better? Okay, I didn't want to like blow everybody's ears out. So what we see is that these treaties, while in the beginning, were beneficial to both groups. But as English viewpoints start to change and we start to see an increase of both colonists coming over from Europe and indigenous populations shrinking and moving away, these treaties start to become less important. And we see land transactions and things like that come into viewpoint after these kind of treaties on a smaller scale. So we go from this kind of larger group, English, all of the English, Massachusetts Bay Colony, talking to all of the Wampanoag, and we start to move into this smaller like land holding, where sachems of particular bands and tribal groups within larger groups begin to do kind of legal transactions. And so what are the characteristic view of legal status of Native Americans, and could rights be compromised? And as Native Americans were pushed off of land in Fairfield County, were they assigned to reservations? So the characteristic view of the legal status of Native Americans was that initially the status was that they had rights, that they had rights to the land, and that especially the Dutch, the English kind of borrowed this from the Dutch. The Dutch viewed it that they had complete rights to the land, that they should be purchasing the land and purchasing the use of the land from the indigenous people, and they did this. And you probably heard the stories of how the Dutch bought Manhattan Island for like 2 blankets and like some copper pots, right? But that's still a purchase. They still purchased it. They didn't like swindle them. That wasn't their thing. Roger Williams, who was a very famous congregational minister who was sent to Rhode Island and forms Rhode Island eventually, was really into this idea of selling land and buying them and honoring indigenous people's rights to the land. John Winthrop, who was a Puritan, who was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s, disagreed with Roger Williams. Disagreed so much that he sent him to Rhode Island, essentially. And one of the things that John Winthrop thought was that there's this idea that comes from England, this idea within medieval land law, where vacant land is allowed to be occupied by the inhabitants of whoever is there. So any vacant space that's not being used can be, in a sense, squatted on by anybody who is looking to use it for farming, for sheeping, for herding, for anything like that. And so this viewpoint, this idea that when Puritans arrive in the 1600s, there is so much vacant land. They view it as vacant. They view these, they come into villages that are abandoned in their eyes, and there's this sense that the indigenous people are already gone, and the ones that are here are moving out, right? And so we have the right to take it. Also, they had a charter from the king. So they were like, we have a charter from the king, and Massanutten, he doesn't have a charter from the king to own this land. And since I have a charter from the king, I can do this, right? So they first thought they had a charter, and then they had this idea that there was things vacant. And initially, they started to buy property with these kind of what we would call usufruct tracts, right? And usufruct is just a really fancy word for this right of usage. And so they would purchase the land from the indigenous people, and the indigenous people would have the right to hunt and fowl and fish on it, right? And do all of these kind of things that they were doing already. And as they proceeded and as we move into the 17th century, this right starts to kind of go away. And we start to see indigenous people writing to colonial governments, writing to what is going to be the Connecticut government, and writing to the Massachusetts Bay Colony saying, hey, we bought this land, we were told we could hunt on it, now we're not able to hunt on it. And all of this comes from worldview, right? From religious worldview. So English people also thought that you couldn't own land if you didn't toil, if you didn't improve it. And how are you not improving land if you're not knocking all the trees down and putting a farm there and having your animals graze there? That's improvement. And so improvement was right next to ownership, right? If you went into a vacant lot in the 13th century in England and improved it by bringing crops in or bringing animals in, you owned it. That was it. And so that's where they were starting from. And so this idea, this legal status of indigenous people becomes compromised as we move forward in time, as we move closer to the 18th century. Here in Fairfield, because Fairfield's founded so early, and then other parts of it are founded so late, we see that there's this change pretty early. The first reservation in the United States is the Golden Hill Pawgasset Reservation in 1659. It is currently the first reservation, the oldest reservation. It's also the smallest reservation in the United States. It is 1/4 of 1 acre in Trumbull. You can drive by, but don't blink because you'll miss it if you drive too fast. And this is, initially, we could argue that they were pushed off, right? But initially, it came from this idea that indigenous people recognized that these treaties and these land tenures they weren't working, right? And so they appealed to the federal governments or to the colonial governments to give them some land that they knew no one could take, that would be in a reserve, in a trust by the government, right? That would not be removed, and that no one would come and take it. And so that's where we see the first types of reservations are these requests, right? As we move forward, you guys know about westward expansion in the 19th century of America, and that reservations tend to take a different toll as we move west as America. But both the English and the Dutch recognized that indigenous people were seeking to have something where they wouldn't have their land taken away. And so these first reservations come from that, right? And then land ownership was really related to Christianity and to worldview, right? You can't own land unless you improve land, and you can't be civilized unless you improve land, and you can't be Christianized unless you're civilized. And so the first step to civilizing anybody is to teach them how to toil. One of the things that we saw within colonial records is that most men who were writing, most Puritan leaders that are writing in the 17th century and describing indigenous people, they're describing them as backwards, as lazy. And one of the reasons why they describe them as backwards, lazy, is because the men hunt. That's what they do. They hunt. The women plant and gather. The men hunt. At the time, hunting was a thing that lords did as a pastime. No one hunted in England. There weren't even spaces to hunt. You could only hunt if you had a forest to hunt in. And the forest was dictated by royalty, right? And so this idea that men would hunt, they would often describe them as, John Winthrop complains that men do this leisure activity that's like for fun instead of toiling. Men should be toiling. That's their job. To toil is to be close to God. To toil is to be a gentleman. And to be civilized is to toil and to work the earth, to change it. And so since they weren't doing that, one of the first things that we see is this attempt by Christian leaders to convince indigenous people to start to grow crops, right? And to start to cut down trees and fence things and own draft animals, right? And so John Eliot was a Puritan leader who started a church. He moved from Roxbury in England and moved to Roxbury in Massachusetts. He didn't like changing names. And one of the first things that he did was he developed these special areas where he could then cultivate first the civilizing aspect of making someone Christian or helping someone to become Christian. We have to remember that it's not as we often think of like interactions with indigenous people as something that we saw in like a John Wayne movie, right? Where it's intentionally bad, intentionally trying to change people. This is not the case. John Eliot was worried about their souls. He wanted them to go to heaven. And the only way he saw that they could go to heaven was by making them wear pants and shirts and toil in the earth, right? And so John Eliot, he started this this kind of series of different towns. There are 14 of them. We often refer to them as praying towns. Natick, Massachusetts is probably the biggest one, right? And they were these spaces in which indigenous Christianized people could live and work and have community. And they were not often seen as a good thing by other indigenous groups. Metacom hated them, right? Uncas, who was the Mohegan sachem, who kind of made it big after the Pequot War by siding with the English, he hated them as well. And so they were kind of seen as the indigenous people in them were kind of seen as like sellouts. Like you sold out to the English, you sold out in order to gain access to resources. And Eliot was so into this that he, along with Increase Mayhew, right? Increase Mayhew was one of the Mayhews on Martha's Vineyard. They both, first Eliot, write a Bible in Algonquian. So he learns Algonquian. And one of the things that we first saw with early missionary work is that there was just a lot of, especially in trade, no one really learned languages. Some indigenous people learned European languages, but a lot of European traders didn't learn. There was a lot of like gesturing and like pointing. And Eliot knew it can't be done. You can't convert someone to Christianity by just gesturing and pointing. Be like, hey. So he learned Algonquian, right? He learned the language of the indigenous people, and he printed the first Bible in the 1640s in Algonquian. And then on Martha's Vineyard, the Mayhews kind of took up this idea as well, with Increase Mayhew printing a second version of this Bible, taking right from John Eliot. But he did something different. He had one page was in Algonquian and one page was in English, so that you could really get a handle of it. And so praying towns were something that were really important because they were this first attempt to enact this civilizing power and then this Christianizing thing. There were not really any Indian schools as of yet. By this, in the 17th century, we don't see any what we would call like Indian schools. It's only later on in the 19th century that we might see this. The reference here is the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Nothing like that. Carlisle is notorious for America pulling out children from reservations and indoctrinating them and cutting their hair and making them speak English and not allowing them to dance. Nothing like that. We have to remember that in the 17th century, indigenous people wanted to do this, right? One of the things we see is with praying towns is that a lot of Wampanoag people are moving to these praying towns to learn things like weaving, to learn things like sheep herding and raising things. They wanted to learn these skills, not so much to be indoctrinated or to be Christianized, but they kind of went along with it in order to learn these skills. Metacom himself, King Philip, raised pigs, and one of the things that actually set off the King Philip's War is that they made him take his pigs off of Pig Island. I don't know if you were aware that off the coast of Massachusetts, there was an island where there were no predators, and all the colonists during the summer put their pigs on this island that they called Hog Island, and Metacom had hogs there because he had intentionally learned how to practice animal husbandry in order to have better relations with the English. And they made him take him off because he wasn't English. And that kind of was like the last straw. He was like, I did all these things. I raised these animals. They didn't eat them. Indigenous people did not eat pigs. They raised them to sell. And he did all these things. And he's like, I did this so that I could be better with it. Now you're kicking me off of Hog Island. It's just kind of funny in a sense. And so these early attempts were this integration, right? This idea that, hey, we need to kind of learn the way that they speak and integrate them into our society before we start to have any problems. What happens to the praying towns is that they grow. There's like 1,000 indigenous people, maybe 1,100 to 1,200 people in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the mid-1600s who are involved in these praying towns. They are gaining kind of power and prestige and honor and flex, if you were, within English communities. And then Metacom, King Philip, starts this war in 1675. And the result of that war is that the English, they couldn't trust the people in praying towns, so they kind of disbanded them. They said, hey, listen, we don't know if you're not going to just kind of flip sides immediately in the middle of this war, because these are still your ancestors, they're still your kin, and so we're going to kind of break this up. And so the praying towns get broken up in 1675, and they don't ever come back. They did try to start some here in Connecticut. There are 4 praying towns in Niantic and along the eastern seaboard, just south of Massachusetts. And these weren't started by John Eliot himself, though he did visit them. They also did not make it after the Pequot War, or the King Philip's War, because this was devastating, right? This was this kind of last attempt for indigenous people to unite together and to go against the English. And it didn't work out for them. Everyone was killed. There was huge losses, especially on the indigenous side. These praying towns were broke up. And it kind of set the tone for a different type of interaction between indigenous people and the English colonizers. And then what we see is this kind of second working of an attempt, right? So Eliza Whitlock, he starts, he is a congregational minister, and he starts with this very famous Mohegan person. His name is Samson Occam. And Samson Occam becomes a Presbyterian minister, and he goes on a speaking tour of Scotland and England and France. And he's basically Whitlock's prodigy. This is the epitome of what it means to have a civilized indigenous person, right? He was well spoken. He spoke English, he spoke French, he spoke Algonquian, and he was exactly what Whitlock was trying to do. Whitlock wanted to start a school. He was sponsored by, and I have to write. Hold on. There was a group called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, and they kind of sponsored him out of Scotland, right? And this is often referred to as the New England Company. They were working out of Scotland and England, and they were sponsoring different ministers to come over here, start schools, start missionary work in the Americas. And Eliza Whitlock was one of them. He sends Samson Occam to England for the speaking tour, in which he is there for a number of years. And while he's there, the Moores Charity School, which is in Lebanon, the building still stands in Lebanon, was kind of starting to thrive. They had Samson Occam as this person who they were like, hey, this is exactly what you could be like. You could be exactly like this if you go through this school. And while Occam is out doing a tour of Europe, the school kind of goes under. And one of the reasons why is that we have all these letters from Eliza Whitlock and his students. And one of the reasons why is that he's trying to do the same thing that John Eliot was trying to do. He starts out by saying, hey, if you're going to be Christian, you have to learn to be civilized. So you need to go and work at this farm. You're going to learn how to raise cattle. You're going to learn how to sow crops. And his students are writing like, hey, why are you making us like a slave? We don't want to be your slave or your indentured servant. We want to learn how to be Christian and learn how to read Latin. He's like, no, you have to learn to do these things first. I often equate it to like, he's thinking, if you remember the film Karate Kid, he thinks he's Mr. Miyagi and that all of the indigenous people are Daniel-san, but it's not really that sense. They don't see themselves as Daniel-san. And so there's this like conflict, and so they leave. They all stop going. And remember, this is a volunteer thing. This is way before we get into like things like Carlisle. And so they leave, and when Occam comes back, the school's not there anymore. And Eliza Whitlock had taken the money that Occam raised, which at the time was 2,500 pounds. That's a lot of money in the 1700s, right? And he had taken the money to start this other school, this other Indian school that he called Dartmouth, right? And you guys might have heard of Dartmouth. So he starts Dartmouth. Occam says, all right, I'll go there, but he never goes there. And until like 1960, Dartmouth had not produced any indigenous scholars. I think outside of like 8 people went there, right? And so this school that was intentionally started to be a Morris charity school by Eliza Whitlock becomes what it is today, Dartmouth, right? And so the people at the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England were not too happy. They took some of the money and that Occam had raised in Scotland, and they kept it. And they keep it until 1936, when someone in their financial department was like, hey, there's this money that's been sitting in the bank since like 1720. What should we do with it? They gave it to some ministers in Africa. It only equaled about 10,000 pounds, which is a horrible bank account. 200 years and you've only made that much interest? It's just not good. So we see that there is this attempt, right? There's still this attempt to like, hey, how do we convert people, but through this kind of like natural way, right? And the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions is something that's set up later on in the 19th century. And what it does is try to fund these kind of foreign missions through different kind of church funds. And it tries to do the same thing that Eliza Whitlock does, right? David Brainerd is a Presbyterian minister that's really known for working with the Seneca and the Delaware and working in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. He writes a book who then Jonathan Edwards, who is a philosopher and theologian, he's best known for the First Great Awakening, being like kind of the founder of the First Great Awakening here in America. He publishes the works of David Brainerd to kind of like re-spark this interest in evangelizing the Native Americans, right? And saying like, hey, we did this in the past, we can do this again. We can continue to have an effect and a profound effect on indigenous people and convert them and save them in a sense, right? And so as we move into the American Revolution by the 1776, things are totally different, right? Most indigenous people, except for down in the South, all here in New England, everybody's either in a reservation. So by 1776, we have the Golden Hill Pawcusset. We have the Scaticook Reservation in Kent. They form in 1736. We have the Mohegan Reservation, and that's about it. Everybody else is kind of disbanded. A lot of people have moved into Massachusetts, where the Stockbridge Munsee form a movement called the Brotherton Movement, and the Pequots still haven't revived themselves completely. Part of them have formed what we now call the Eastern Pequot, one of our 5 recognized tribes. But by 1776, a lot of New England tribes, especially here in Connecticut, are kind of disbanded or have regrouped into new groups. The Scaticook are a formation of 5 other groups who have been completely decimated and post-colonial and kind of regroup in Kent in the 1730s. And so, did Native Americans participate in the American Revolution? Yeah, they did. They did. They participated on both sides, but primarily on the English side. And one of the reasons why is that the English did a little thing where they promised not to encroach on their land anymore. They're like, listen, these rebels, they're going to take your land. But remember that one time back in 1620 when we didn't take your land? We'll do that again if you fight for us. And so we see a lot of indigenous groups, especially in the Hudson Valley, fight for the British. And this becomes problematic when the British lose, obviously. And so were Native people rewarded in helping Americans during the Revolutionary War? Yes, in a sense. If they helped them, they were rewarded. They were told that they were going to get property and citizenships in this new country. None of it really happened or came to fruition. Indigenous people don't get citizenship until into the late 19th century, into the 20th century. They don't get the active vote. We're actually celebrating the 100th anniversary this year of the Indigenous right to active vote in 1924. So while we see that Indigenous people in the American Revolution got nothing, we do see this beginning of Indigenous people serving in the military. Out of all ethnic groups that exist in America since its inception, Indigenous people make up the largest percentage of services in the armed forces, which is crazy to think about since it did them no good for almost 200 years to serve in the armed forces in America. They didn't get citizenship, they didn't get the right to vote, they got nothing for it except for to serve. And we still see that today. Indigenous people make up a large percentage of armed forces people. So were there attempts to evangelize people in this later period in the 19th century? Yeah, and I think the biggest example is written right here, the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall, or what they call the Heathen School in Cornwall. And so this was set up by a gentleman named, his last name is Gold, and it was set up to be not an indigenous school, but a mission school for everyone, for anybody who was not American. And its goal was to put people in place within communities. And so one of the things that different pastors had learned over this long period of trying to convert Indigenous people was that even if you learn the language, even if you teach them and tell them to wear pants, even if you tell them how to toil the earth, it's not going to work. The best way to do it is to go kind of the Whitlock route, which is to get someone within that group to become Christianized, to become educated, and then send them back to do the work of God there. And so that's what the Foreign Mission School meant to do. It sought out individuals from throughout the world, and their first student was a Hawaiian. His name was Henry Okapaioa, and he unfortunately passed away before he graduated. And he was buried in a cemetery near Cornwall and was not reinterned and sent back to Hawaii until the 1990s, when the state archaeologist here in Connecticut recovered his body and reinterred him back in Hawaii. But there were so many other students. There were students from Japan, there were students from China, there were students from all parts of the Americas who were attending this foreign mission school. And they were taught the classics. They were taught Koine Greek, they were taught Latin, they were taught Hebrew, and they were taught all of the classic literature. They read Homer, they read the Bible, they read all of these things. The point was to civilize the people and send them back to where they came from to then spread the good word. And you might have heard of their most famous student because of what happened. Was it successful? Yeah, I guess it was. It was sort of successful. It was successful in the sense that it produced a few students who did go back to their communities and did change the way that their communities interacted with the American society. One of those was, there was a gentleman named Elias Boutineau. And so Elias Boutineau and his cousin John Ridge, these are their English names, these are not their indigenous names. They get them, there was a thing when you would come and learn from English people or from Europeans, you would take their name. And so Elias Boutineau, on his trip up from the Carolinas, he was Cherokee, he stops at the home of Elias Boutineau, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and asks to use his name. And he grants him the right to use his name. He changes his name to Elias Boutineau. He attends the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall. He becomes a theologian, but he also falls in love with Harriet Gold, the headmaster's daughter. And they become engaged. People were not happy about this. So much so that Harriet Gold's brother burned effigies of them in the town square upon hearing their engagement and tried to burn down the school and kicked open the door and threw some fire in there. So they escaped, right? They left, they moved back to Cherokee. They have something like 6 children. Harriet Gold dies, giving birth to like their 7th child. And Elias Boutno goes on to found the Cherokee Phoenix, the first ever newspaper written in Cherokee syllabary and English. And he really promotes theology among the Cherokee. He is also one of the people who are on the council who would inevitably decide to move to the West and get rid of their property, give it to the federal government and sell it to the government, and have all of their people move in what we call now the Trail of Tears, right? And because of that, there were 8 people on that council. Elias Boutno was killed, I believe, with a hatchet to the head on the same day, like in a year anniversary of this decision, right? But part of that decision comes from his upbringing and his education, knowing that they weren't going to change the American government, that they needed to do something in order to kind of invigorate themselves and integrate themselves in with the American ideas. And so the Foreign Mission School, while it failed, did produce a couple of interesting people. If you're interested in the Foreign Mission School, there's a great book out of Yale University Press that came out, I think, in 2009 about this. Really interesting, and the town of Cornwall puts on a whole bunch of things at their historical society about it. Last thing, Southport Congregational Church said that they have a record of offerings being dedicated to a Native American mission in South Dakota in 1843. Was this typical? This was typical in the sense that congregational churches and other churches had these mission kind of groups where, like the propagation of Christianity in New England, where they kind of banded together and formed these groups that could then funnel funds into bringing missionaries out. Specifically, within Fairfield County, I don't know a lot. These are kind of things that you have to look up in church records, but, that's my timer. But there's definitely a movement to create societies and create groups where they could continue this idea of Christianizing individuals out west, where they did recognize that westward expansion and American expansionism was affecting indigenous groups, and they sought to change that. They sought to help with that by saving the souls of those individuals. So that was really quick. I went through a lot of things. I hope that I didn't talk too fast and you learned a little bit of things. Did we want to open it up for some questions?
Hi, I'm Nancy Rosa, and I had the pleasure of meeting you, Paul, last July and August when I visited AIAI with my family, first with my grandchildren and then with my cousins. I'm Nancy Rosa, and I am part of the Harris line of the Schaghticoke Indian tribe from Connecticut. We were honored that you were able to bring us down to the vault to see baskets that were made by my great-great-grandparents and, explain the whole